If you're new to Strategic Command World War II World at War, I've made some beginner's guides you can find in the playlist below. Today, we're going to be building on top of that information, specifically looking at the Allies, their perspective. If you're starting up a 1939 campaign and you've picked the Allies, we're going to go over maybe some things you should be doing in the beginning to get started, some things that maybe you should know. And if you're between choosing the Allies or the Axis, I would definitely recommend the Allies as your first playthrough, because you're just supposed to get beat up the first half of the campaign anyway. It's great for learning, and the timeline goes to 1947. The Allies make way more money than the Axis in the long run, so it's really in your favor to be the Allies first rather than the Axis, because the Axis plays on a much different timeline, far more constrained. They need to accomplish a lot very quickly in order to actually win. The first power you're going to be concerned with is Poland, and as you start up, you'll actually get prompted by two events. One of them is, do you want the Red Army to march into Poland as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? Well, it's really up to you. If you do, then Russia will technically be providing a small amount of MPPs via trade agreements to Germany after that all goes through, but you will get a much closer border right over here to Germany, and this will allow you to figure out your defense of the Soviet Union a lot easier. No matter what you do with the Soviets, however, Poland is going to die. With Germany able to focus on Poland in 1939, Poland will die. Your defense of Poland is just, how long can I stretch this out? How much damage can I do in the meantime? And the answer is not a lot. Germany will destroy some of your units before the turn even gets given to you, and you can't really do a whole lot of damage in general. Your best chance is to take your very, very minimal MPPs, use it on reinforcing key units, and if anything seems worthy, you're going to want to swap them out, like get them one hex away from Warsaw, for example. Swap them out, not this garrison, but, you know, for example, maybe a corps or an army if you could pull it off, if everything just doesn't get destroyed before then. And then shift left click to swap in to retain the entrenchment, because this garrison will get slaughtered in one turn if it comes down to it. Though, actually getting Germany to take a third turn is a little difficult. A fourth turn and onwards, very difficult. Poland will die, so all you really need to worry about is putting up some tiny defense. Use it as a little practice ground to actually learn how the game works and try to make Germany kill as many of your units as possible before Warsaw dies. The next nation you'll be dealing with in the war, who ends up in the war the moment it's your turn, is France. Now, France, you're going to be wanting to fight defensively. You don't want to go on the offensive. But there's some things you want to consider. So the other event you'll get prompted for, that you could pick a choice for, is whether or not to deploy the BEF to France. You're going to want to do this, basically guaranteed. If you don't, France loses a bunch of morale and they will topple a lot easier than they should. You'll get an army and 2 corps and an HQ, I believe, all sent from the Brits, deployed immediately into France. France exists in this zone where they don't really have enough MPP income to do a whole lot. It's one of the ways the game kind of nerfs them to get them the historical results overall. So what you're going to want to do is try to make your defense around here as stiff as possible, where the Germans will be invading from, the Low Countries. The Maginot Line you need to keep defended, but it's not super important. You see, you have an army, a corps, an army, and a corps. These 3 armies need to move. So remember what I said about how you switch units. So one thing you're going to want to do, for example, it doesn't have to be done immediately. You just got to do it before this happens, and the AI will invade the Low Countries shortly after it's done with Poland. So kind of use that as your timetable. You're going to want to maybe reinforce these corps, for example, and then move them over here, for example. And then once they're here, you can shift left click and then swap them into the fortifications, and then you'll see they'll keep their entrenchment. This will free up armies and the like to be sent up this way to be more powerful in defending against the enemy. The French don't really have the ability to afford any early research. You have to really save up to do it. It's better spent on reinforcements because you start out not quite fully prepared. All these units basically need some kind of reinforcements. The planes are nice, but you won't really get to use them a whole lot. They're very expensive. The bombers, basically, really no point to keeping, no point to using a lot. Keep them out of harm's way. They're really expensive to maintain. You're going to need the MPPs for other things as a last priority. You'll be given some events to form a Polish corps. It's really just a French corps, just named Polish corps. Do that. That's great to get another corps to defend. And an engineer that you have to transport from the Spanish border up north to really do anything. It's not bad. You could get some fortifications behind, maybe about right here somewhere, if you so choose to. However, it's pretty last minute and you won't get a whole lot out of it, but it's not a terrible thing to do. You won't get to use that on a lot of other things anyway. With that, it just comes down to use the BEF to defend yourself, but make sure the BEF have the capacity to reach a port either by accessibility or by operational movement so that they can escape, because you don't want the BEF to die. So that's just really your goal. Hold off for as long as possible, because that will get the Russians some more time to defend and maybe give Greece a little bit more of a lifespan in the future. And we'll talk about that as we go through. But more than likely, especially as a new player, like 99% chance France will die. France will die. The Navy, you could use pretty aggressively because you're not really going to get to use them. Thankfully, they have these markers now. They didn't used to have this. But essentially, it's just teaching you don't move more than one allied amphibious unit into this region, into the Mediterranean, like in this region. And the other one's saying don't move 7 allied naval units total within this region, for example. So all these French ships, you could take them and you could just start using them. You're not really going to get to reinforce them or anything, but you could use them to either try to hunt. There's 2 German cruisers out in the Atlantic at the start of the game. You can try to hunt them down. You could also try to just block off places subs would go, for example. Use your own subs to maybe do a little bit of raiding on the very few options like Norway, Germany. That's about it. If you want to, and maybe try to provoke a fight. But you're not going to get a whole lot of use out of what France has. Just do your best. Italy will invade from the south if you don't fall too quickly. So leaving a corps down here, not too bad. Maybe over here as well. They're very bad at attacking, but yeah, 2 corps, great. Lets you keep 20 MPPs a turn from this mine right here if you do hold off in this region. The mountains make it pretty easy to defend, so I would recommend at least putting that minimal defense down there. It's a pretty low priority because Italy does take a while to enter the war. You could track their mobilization by checking right here, for example. When the Low Countries join the war, don't expect to be able to do much with them. They're just gonna die. Same thing with Denmark. Norway will just kind of be taken over by event. You will have the opportunity to have Britain and France potentially send assistance to Finland if you want, send help. If you do the winter invasion, for example, with the USSR, I would suggest doing it. Both the invasion and sending the expeditionary forces there, because it makes winter equipment for the Soviets cheaper later. And it could also have a very small chance of getting Finland to join you in the war. And having that front open usually isn't too problematic because it's still the same budget as what Germany's working with, but there is a lot of variables to that, so you'll need to look at the percentages yourself and kind of come up with your own solution. But once France is out of the war, then you can expect probably to be fighting in Greece, get a British unit over here as soon as possible. If you want to boost the morale there against the AI, a successful defense can be done. I did it in my PvE playthrough, for example. But if you don't want to be defending heavily in Greece, then that means next you're going to be focusing primarily on the UK, whose dominions of, say, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all of them will be joining. They don't always join at the very beginning, but they will be joining. Other nations can be joining later as well, such as Malaya. Malaya can join early via an event, but it and others, for example, will join when the war with Japan begins, Burma as well. It's up to you if you want Malaya to join earlier. Again, it will join anyways. Just like, do you want to pay to get them early for any prep work? India as well, you'll be prompted to have them join pretty much around this point or wait until they vote to join later. Usually, it seems like you want to do it immediately. The MPPs you get in the long run is just much better. There are some riots that you'll have to deal with around this region, dealing with supply and industry, but that doesn't really seem to affect a whole lot. compared to getting them early and getting to send some Indians to Africa to assist with wiping out Ethiopia and just strengthening, maybe, for example, the defense of Egypt. The UK itself with the BEF should be defending the Isles. The AI isn't really going to try a sea lion. A player might, so you might want that stuff at the Isles. Otherwise, a player might try to finish France off down here in Algeria. So you may want to send the BEF there if that's what the player does, if they don't make a Vichy France. But otherwise, getting them out alive, especially that army, before France gets completely overwhelmed, is an ideal thing for the defense of Great Britain. You can get a home guard set up as well via an event. I would definitely accept that. At the beginning, the Navy does have to maybe worry about those 2 German heavy cruisers out here that it could deal with. You're going to have to get destroyers patrolling, ready to trade some MPPs back and forth to deal with German raiders, submarines you'll be dealing with over here. You could try to blockade them a little bit, for example, but once they get Norway, you're kind of putting yourself in danger. Don't get too close. Otherwise, German air power could fuck you up, and a player could easily use Norway as a bit of a unsinkable aircraft carrier to bomb your ships, so you have to be careful about that while defending all your convoy routes. And you'll be waging the fight for Egypt as well, where you'll want to probably be a little bit aggressive initially. You'll want to definitely wipe out Africa as much as possible, and definitely probably end up finishing it off with America when they join with Operation Torch if you want to play historically. When Italy's in the war, be wary of using your ships, your UK ships over in the Mediterranean, because they can have the human torpedoes, which if you're in any ports is like a 1% chance that they do some damage to you. So you're going to want to be careful about that. Otherwise, UK has a lot on its plate. You're going to be handling Europe for the most part for a long time, and eventually you're going to have to be participating over here in the East as well. Getting ships over there, defending Australia, maybe defending against the Japs over here, depending how well you do in China. Now, China is a place where a lot's up in the air, and a lot could determine, how involved the other nations have to get in this region. In my PvE that I posted, I actually beat Japan almost exclusively by using China. And so there's a couple different strategies you could take. If you're fighting a player, things would be a little different, but essentially, Japan has the ability to just wipe the floor with you pretty early on, and so you need to do some things to counter that. You do need to hold your ground, that's first and foremost. That's the most important thing. You need to hold your ground as much as possible and make Japan bleed if it wants to beat you up. Pakoi is a good option to look at trying to take in the beginning, because if you take it early enough, the Japs can't get Haiphong. If you take Haikou, then they can't get Indochina in general. So aiming some sort of offensive with some of your spare units in the rear, for example, could actually be a pretty useful thing. The Japs don't have a lot down here at all, and in my start, they actually moved this garrison, giving me a free partisan unit. The AI would certainly probably make some more mistakes like that as well. Probably another player would. So you're going to want to focus on stuff like that. Early on is when China's going to have the most MPPs available to it via the Hanoi-Kunming rail line, and that's why defending this as much as possible is ideal. The Hanoi-Kunming Railroad is going to be a bit of a concern to you. When you lose it, things are only going to get worse for you. So you're going to want to be careful to keep your MPPs up so that you can keep reinforcing your stuff, forcing Japan to bleed on you. They will out-earn you. However, if they focus on you, then they won't be prepared for America or anybody else later. So you want to keep your units strong. If you're looking at doing any research, then infantry weapons is the most important one. If you double up on it, it'll research faster, but you might also want some other things as well. However, infantry weapons is the most important. I would say infantry warfare, command and control after that, because you're going to want to be focusing these armies and corps. If anything dies, you'll be able to remake it for cheaper as well. An air force is expensive, hard to get going, hard to keep going. If you have trouble maintaining it, I'd recommend getting some anti-air units going instead. Not as good of coverage, but wouldn't really invest into any bombers. If you're really successful, maybe I would go for some advanced fighters. But really, you're going to be wanting to be focusing on those land forces for sure. Diplomacy, you don't really need. Don't really need diplomacy for anybody that I mentioned so far. The UK can dabble in diplomacy, but diplomacy for the Allies is weird. We'll talk about that in a little bit, because Communist China here will just join you if you start losing anywhere, really. If you don't end up losing very much, then you could try to spend to get Communist China to join. However, if you're winning, you don't really need them at the same time, so it's not really that big of a deal. Japan's going to be strongest initially, kind of right in this region here, so that's where you want your stiffest defense, and weakest up here, and then more importantly, down in the south. If you're able to win in the south, you could then really reorient your units as much as possible, but if you can't win in the south, expect Indochina to open up. If you at least don't lose Nanning, then you can definitely go into Indochina yourself, taking that over. And China is an uncooperative country, so anything it takes over will immediately kind of become loyal to it if it, like, liberates them, for example. Because Indochina would be occupied by the Japs, so if it's liberated, it would go back to, say, whoever owns that on the Allied side, the French or the Brits, and then Communist China would actually overwrite that because they're a non-cooperative major. And then any progress you make down here would go like that. You could also stop Thailand from joining in general, thus protecting the British assets in the region, protecting the Burma Road if you have lost the Hanoi-Kunming rail line, and if you retake Hanoi, it will actually reopen the Hanoi-Kunming rail line, giving you those delicious MPPs from America that spawn for free, which you will be prompted to send over there very early on via event, by the way. Definitely take it. If anything ever asks you for America, do you want to send something to China? Just always say yes. Send something to China? Yes. China's very valuable for you. And that's basically China. That's how you get started as China. Now, glimpsing over to the next major that you're going to get access to is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's definitely a bit of a complicated one. Just like China, we have to consider a lot of things. You know, India, you don't really have to consider a lot of things except whether to join early or not. You're not going to have enough money to do most things. Just pick a thing you want to focus and go with it. Probably infantry, you know. Russia, though, you had to decide, you know, where the border was already, if you were going into Finland or not already, and now you have to decide how to withstand the German tide. Now, for me, you know, I had the UK invest into Greece, and then the Soviets never even got invaded, and then they just overwhelmed Europe pretty quickly after that. But you might not have that if this is your first playthrough. You might have something a little more historical. So what you're going to need to pick is a line of defense. When the Axis attack you, then you're going to have to deal with the fact that the first turn, the Germans get a little bit of a buff on you. A bunch of free units will spawn on the border, but they will die basically immediately. With your not immediately spawned in units, you know, the ones you have right now that you'll be getting, that you'll be paying for, you're going to have to choose what to do. Going into infantry weapons, very, very useful as the Soviets here. You are going to need probably some fighter coverage. That's important. You know, the infantry warfare command and control. Tanks can be very useful for the Soviets, so you might want that, but it's very expensive, as is going into bombers. The priority needs to be on infantry to hold the line, fighters to protect them, because you got a lot of space and normal anti-air stuff that's not going to work right here. Navy is basically irrelevant. You're never going to have a good enough Navy to really do anything with. No matter what kind of a Navy the Soviets would have, you're not really going to have much of that here. And you'll get options to pump convoys into the Soviets to beef them up, and you want to do that. Doesn't really matter if you're losing a lot of MPPs as the Soviets. The whole idea is to just outlast Germany until the other allies are ready to open new fronts, essentially. So you want to pick, like, points of defense, and you want to choose if you want to try to be static or fluid. This river, the Dnieper, and going up and past the swamp is definitely a popular line of defense. However, it's hard to do a fortified defense with the Soviets because the Germans will crash through pretty quickly, quite honestly. So you got to be prepared for a lot of losses if you choose that. You can also try a more forward defense, but with the German buff on the first turn, you want to be really careful because there's not a lot of defensible terrain up here in general. A rear defense is also a lot harder than maybe the Dnieper, but by that point, it might be the winter. Germany might be getting debuffed from the winter. And then some sort of rolling defense going inwards towards Moscow and etc. would be a thing as well. So long as you have a lot of units, then it doesn't matter if you lose all three capitals, you still stay in the fight, no matter what. But somewhere around here is where I'd probably recommend making your initial stalwart defense. And focus on the numbers. Don't worry too much about the losses. You're going to be purchasing a lot of units, rebuilding a lot of units. Researching, I mentioned, you know, you're going to want the infantry weapons first and foremost. And then, of course, some things that make MPPs cheaper. You're going to be producing, reinforcing a lot. Things that buff up some HQs would be great as well. Just avoid the really expensive stuff like bomber techs, and also avoid things like ASW and ship type text, because you don't really need that stuff. It's going to be really up to a lot of different starting parameters how the Soviets go, but that is how I'd recommend trying to get into it. But it is going to be painful. It's not supposed to be not painful as the Soviets. And that's the Soviets. And now we have the final one, the most important one, yet the one that does not need to be invaded in any capacity for your opponent to win a decisive victory, and that's America. America makes enough MPPs that they make more MPPs by default than the entire Axis combined will probably make by the time America enters the war. They could dump a lot of their MPPs into China, into the UK, and even others with events. And it's going to be up to you if you want to go like America Strong and do less Lend-Lease. I'd recommend actually doing more Lend-Lease thing. Every option you have to give MPPs to someone, take it. Because if America is going to get involved in the war, they're going to have to pay for a transport. They're going to have to send it across the ocean. That's a lot of wasted MPPs. If the UK has the MPPs instead, it could go into different fronts that are already open. If the Soviets have the fronts instead, you know, you could send MPPs to the UK and then have that sent to the Soviets. And now you don't need to send anything to try to open any fronts. The Soviets just keep fighting. The Soviets just keep doing things. So America has that. You definitely want to be really, really research heavy as America. Always like max out that research, dude, because they share research with others, buffing up the research of others, and they're not gonna be doing a lot for the first half anyway, and the timeline goes until like 47. So you have all this extra time that you can utilize that America will get better and better at utilizing. You'll probably want to pick if you want to focus the Pacific first in Japan or somebody else. It is really hard to focus down the Pacific due to the island hopping campaign, because you're going to be more limited on units that are even good at that. You know, special forces, things like that. You want to get as many special forces as possible, though, to support this island hopping campaign. All the other units you have can be sent somewhere, and they probably should be, because you want to do something with them. And America has the MPPs to do just about anything. It doesn't even matter if they lose 2 carriers, right? Because they can rebuild that in 1 turn. Whereas, like, if Japan lost 2 carriers, I don't know if they'd really get a chance to rebuild them. An Operation Torch, definitely something to consider, or just skipping to Italy, which is what I did. Of course, D-Day to worry about. You gotta pick your targets based on how your game is going. And America enters a little late in, so it's hard to prepare with them. Early on, again, I'd really just focus on that research. And now, diplomacy. So with diplomacy, all your majors are gonna be able to do some kind of diplomacy. For clarity, America's the best at this. Once America's in the war, their MPPs into diplomacy are just worth more than anybody else's. They have more chits generally, and their chits do more, just in general. So America should be doing a lot of diplomacy once they're in the war. UK is a good one to use diplomacy on. China, not so much. Poland and France, you won't really get a chance. Russia, maybe, but as the allies, you gotta play pretty reactionary. Who you even get in depends on your strategy, but your strategy depends on how well the enemy does. Because that's really what it comes down to. You can just build units and ignore diplomacy altogether. The Axis really doesn't have too much reason to use diplomacy. There's some strategies, but it's not as important. Just some ideas, because I don't think there's a lot of like right and wrong here as the allies, because you just have so much MPPs and options. Is I actually went out of my way to get Finland into the war on my side. That's something you could consider if you want this to be friendly, especially if you fail the actually getting them to be allied friendly after the invasion, if you choose the Soviets to roll in. So that's like an option if you want this to be friendly and have, you know, just another front that you don't have to worry about. Additionally, Turkey's a pretty unique country. They start out basically just as strong as Italy does. They're worth quite a bit, and they could bolster a Middle East that belongs to the UK, for example. Now, you can get Persia by event, so you don't really need to worry about that. Iraq also sort of by event. Ireland, you could get the ports from event, so that's really another thing you don't need to worry about. Spain is hard to turn, and you don't necessarily want Spain. Portugal's a decent one, and it gives you a lot of options and a lot more naval control over this region that you want to be in control over, that the Axis might want to utilize. So that's another one to think about. It might be tempting to get Mongolia to join you as the Soviets, for example, because they would align to the Soviets, but Mongolia really doesn't add anything. You don't get much of any units with them. I did this, so I should know. And only 5 MPPs a turn. That's not going to pay itself off, like, ever. Even though they start out very well leaning towards the Soviets in general. Like, more units with that MPPs would be more helpful than actually getting Mongolia. A lot of the countries in the Americas will just join the Allies by event, so you don't need to worry too much about a lot of those, and they're also just not anywhere strategic. It's usually best to think about your overall strategy when looking at diplomacy and how you should be factoring that into your game plan. The Allies can definitely be more reactionary. Turkey is definitely one to consider. That's a pretty major one, I would say. Portugal's a decent one, and there's some events to help you, but not enough to get it over. Maybe Spain if you want, but I've seen even the AI diplo them into the Axis, so you might be fighting a losing battle there. But you do have more diplo capability than the Axis does because you have more majors. Regardless though, with so many majors, you have a lot of options for actual units, and so diplomacy should mainly be a tool of countering what your enemy is doing rather than trying to think up some grand strategy by yourself. But that can work. With how much money the Allies get, I don't think there's one perfect way to play them. You have a lot of options and play styles that will work. So that's it. I hope this has been helpful to helping you understand how to get started with all the different nations and what you can do with them and how you should look at using them for the first couple years. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. I'll be making one of these for the Axis that'll be going in the playlist in the description below, where this video also is, in a series of guides that I am making. For now though, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope I'll see you on another one.